We must ensure the straps are tight. This machine will restore balance to your mind.
The latch is set, Doctor. Get me out of here!
The mud of the New Jersey roadside on January 3, 1777, was not merely a slurry of earth and winter rain. It was a freezing, viscous trap that seized the wheels of artillery caissons and the boots of exhausted infantrymen alike, turning the approach to Princeton into a trough of misery. The air was sharp enough to crack the skin, carrying with it the damp chill of the Delaware River Valley. Dr. Benjamin Rush, 31 years old and shivering in his greatcoat, rode toward the sound of the guns. He was a man of science in a landscape of chaos, a volunteer surgeon thrust into the raw, unmediated reality of a war that had, until these frantic winter weeks, been a narrative of desperate retreat. The engagement at Princeton had been a collision of chaotic violence. General Hugh Mercer, leading the American vanguard, had been overrun by the disciplined volley and bayonet charge of the British 17th Regiment. It was a brutal, close-quarters fight where muskets, once discharged, became bludgeons, and the triangular steel of bayonets did the work of butchers. By the time Rush arrived at the Thomas Clarke House, a Quaker farmhouse hastily requisitioned as a field hospital, the tide of battle had surged past, leaving behind a debris field of human wreckage. Rush entered the Clarke House, and the sensory assault was immediate. It was not merely the visual spectacle of blood, bright arterial sprays staining the floorboards and dark, pooling, venous flows, but the olfactory density of the room. The metallic tang of iron mixed with the sulphurous choke of spent gunpowder, the sour sweat of men who had been marching for days without respite, and the peculiar, sweet rot of bowels opened by British steel. The house groaned with the sounds of the dying, the guttural rasp of punctured lungs, the sharp cries of men with shattered limbs, and the low, delirious murmuring of those slipping into shock. In one of the cramped rooms, General Hugh Mercer lay in agony. The general, a Scottish physician himself, and a man Rush revered for a character, marked with all the traits of one of the heroes of antiquity, had been brutalized. He had been bayoneted 7 times and bludgeoned on the head with the butt of a musket when he refused to surrender. Rush approached the general, noting the pallor of his skin and the feeble, slow pulse that indicated profound shock. Mercer's uniform was tattered, stiff with coagulating blood that had turned black in the cold air. There was no sterile field here, no anesthesia beyond the numbing shock of trauma. Rush's hands, cold and stained, worked with a practiced, desperate speed. He examined the bayonet punctures. In 1777, a bayonet wound was a jagged, triangular tear that defied easy suturing, designed to create a wound that would not close. The deeper wounds in Mercer's abdomen were particularly grave, likely leaking intestinal contents into the peritoneal cavity, a sentence of slow, septic death that no surgeon of the era could reverse. Rush dressed the wounds with linen that was far from sterile, binding the broken body of the hero. He spoke words of comfort that felt hollow against the physical reality of the injuries. Yet Mercer remained lucid, his concern for the cause overriding his own dissolution. Around them, the house was a tableau of suffering. Rush moved from patient to patient, stepping over men who lay on piles of straw or bare floorboards. He saw men with limbs shattered by musket balls, heavy lead projectiles of a .75 caliber that flattened on impact, turning bone into shrapnel and tearing massive exit wounds. For these, there was often only one remedy: amputation. The saw rasped through bone, a sound that set the teeth on edge, punctuated by the screams of men held down by their comrades. Rush observed the conditions with a critical, almost furious eye. He noted the want of cleanliness, the excessive fatigue, and the crowding too many patients together, factors he would later identify as the true killers of the American Army. Among the dead, Rush found Captain William Leslie, a British officer and the son of the Earl of Leven. Leslie had been a friend of Rush's during his medical studies in Edinburgh. The discovery was a sharp, personal blow, piercing the professional detachment Rush tried to maintain. He wept, a rare display of emotion for a man who prided himself on scientific rigor. He arranged for Leslie's burial, a gesture of humanity that transcended the political chasm of the war, treating the enemy officer with the same dignity as the Patriot general. The farmhouse was freezing. Windows had been blown out or left open to vent the smoke, letting in the biting January air. The wounded shivered violently, their blue lips signaling hypothermia that compounded their shock. Rush saw the early signs of putrid fever, typhus, that stalked the camps, borne by the lice that infested every seam of the soldiers' uniforms. The general use of linen instead of woolen clothes in the winter months, which Rush had railed against, was taking its toll. As night fell, the only light came from tallow candles and the dying embers of the hearth. Rush continued his rounds, checking pulses, changing sodden dressings, and offering the only thing he had in abundance: his presence. He was a doctor in the midst of a slaughterhouse, armed with little more than lancets, bandages, and an unshakable belief in his own capacity to reason with death. He watched Mercer fade, the general's life leaking away over days of agony, a slow death that Rush chronicled with the precision of a physician and the sorrow of a patriot. The battle was won, but in the Clarke House, the war against mortality was being lost, hour by agonizing hour. The heat in Philadelphia in August 1793 was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on the cobblestones and stifled the air in the narrow alleys near the waterfront. It was a wet, stagnant heat, a blanket of humidity that trapped the smells of the city, the rotting refuse in the gutters, the offal from the markets, and the brackish stagnation of the Delaware River. In the rain barrels and the marshes, the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, unrecognized as the vectors of doom, bred in the millions. By late August, a new terror had supplanted the weather. The city, usually the bustling, noisy capital of the young republic, had fallen into an ominous, heavy silence. Dr. Benjamin Rush sat in his carriage, the leather seats hot against his back, as he moved through streets that were emptying by the hour. The federal government had fled. George Washington was gone. Thomas Jefferson was gone. The wealthy merchants and the social elite had packed their goods and retreated to the countryside, leaving behind the poor, the enslaved, and the desperate. Rush had stayed. He had sent his wife, Julia, and their children to the safety of Princeton, but he remained at his post on Walnut Street, driven by a providential sense of duty and a dangerous confidence in his own medical theories. The smell of the city was changing. The usual odors of horse manure and wood smoke were overlaid with the acrid scent of vinegar and camphor. People walked down the middle of the streets, holding vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs to their faces, avoiding the sidewalks where they might brush against a house harboring the infection. Bonfires burned on corners, fed with tar and gunpowder, thick black smoke choking the air in a futile attempt to purify the miasma that Rush and his contemporaries believed was the source of the pestilence. Rush's destination was a cramped row house in the Northern Liberties. He entered to find a scene that had become horrifyingly familiar. The patient, a young cooper, lay on a cot, his skin glowing with a deep saffron jaundice that gave the fever its name. His eyes were injected with blood, staring wildly, the pupils dilated. He was in the final black vomit stage of the fever. Rush watched as the man convulsed, retching up a dark, tarry substance, digested blood, that signaled the total collapse of the internal organs. The room smelled of death and metallic blood. Rush felt a grim resolve harden within him. The standard treatments of the day, gentle barks, quinine, wine, and cold baths, were failing. His patients were dying by the dozen. He needed a weapon as ferocious as the disease itself. He turned to his medical texts, scouring them for precedent. He found a manuscript by Dr. John Mitchell from a 1741 outbreak in Virginia. Mitchell described the stomach and intestines of victims filled with blood. Rush's conclusion was immediate and dogmatic. The disease was a result of vascular excitement. an overstimulation of the blood vessels. The cure, therefore, must be depletion. He returned to his study, his mind racing. He formulated a new, radical protocol. He would purge the body of its toxic bile and lower the excitement of the blood. He compounded a powder of 10 grains of calomel, mercury chloride, and 10 grains of jalap, a toxic root, a dose 3 times the standard potency. He called them 10 and 10, but the city would soon know them as Rush's Thunderbolts. They were designed to induce violent, uncontrollable bowel movements, forcing the body to expel the morbific matter. But purging was not enough. He picked up his lancet. The steel gleamed in the candlelight. He believed he needed to remove blood, massive quantities of it. Not the usual 10 ounces, but 30, 40, even 80 ounces over a few days. He reasoned that he had to drain the system until the patient fainted, effectively resetting the chaotic pulse. On September 3rd, Rush tested his heroic cure. He administered the mercury and jalap. He opened the veins. He watched the blood flow into the basin, dark and heavy. He ignored the protests of other physicians who called it murder. He was a man possessed by a singular conviction. He alone had found the key to the plague. The death carts rattled outside, the cry of "Bring out your dead," echoing through the hollow streets. But inside, Rush prepared his lancet for the next patient, his own fatigue gnawing at the edges of his vision. He stood on the precipice of a medical war that would either save Philadelphia or bleed it dry. To understand the man standing in the blood-soaked room in 1793, one must look back to the forge where his intellect was tempered. Benjamin Rush was not merely a doctor, he was a product of the Enlightenment, a man who believed that the chaotic world could be ordered by reason and rigid systems. Born in 1746 in Byberry, Pennsylvania, Rush was a prodigy. He graduated from the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, at 14, a fact that instilled in him a lifelong confidence in his own intellectual precocity. But it was his time in Edinburgh, Scotland, from 1766 to 1768 that truly shaped him. There he studied under William Cullen, the most renowned medical theorist of the age. Cullen taught that diseases were not separate, disparate entities, but variations of a single underlying state, an imbalance in the nervous system or the blood vessels. He classified illnesses like a botanist classified plants, seeking a unified theory of pathology. Rush absorbed this, but his mind, craving simplicity and unity, stripped it of Cullen's nuance. Rush eventually concluded that there was, in fact, only one disease in the world: irregular convulsive action of the blood vessels. If all disease was one, then there could be one universal cure: depletion. If the vessels were overexcited, one must bleed and purge them into submission. This was heroic medicine. Heroic not for the patient, but for the physician who dared to take such aggressive measures against the ravages of nature. Rush returned to Philadelphia in 1769, the first professor of chemistry in the colonies. He moved in the highest circles, dining with Adams and Jefferson. When the Continental Congress convened, Rush was there, not just as a physician, but as a revolutionary. He signed the Declaration of Independence, his signature a testament to his belief that old systems, whether monarchical or medical, must be overthrown if they were corrupt. His revolutionary zeal extended to his medical practice. He treated the poor with the same intensity as the rich, often for free, believing that God is their paymaster. But his benevolence was autocratic. He dictated treatments with the absolute authority of a man who believed he was an instrument of divine and scientific truth. He was dogmatic, thin-skinned, and incapable of admitting error. This dogmatism was the core of his character. The doctor who rushed into battlefields and plague zones was driven by a messianic certainty. When he looked at a wounded soldier or a fever victim, he did not just see a suffering human. He saw a physiological puzzle that he had solved. His heroism was a double-edged scalpel. It drove him to stay in Philadelphia when others fled, to walk into the typhus wards of the war, but it also blinded him to the possibility that his aggressive cures might be killing the very people he sought to save. He was a founding father not just of a nation, but of a specifically American style of medicine. Aggressive, interventionist, and supremely confident. The winter of 1777-1778 was not merely cold, it was a bureaucratic and sanitary catastrophe. While Rush is often remembered for the battlefield, his most vicious war was fought with a quill pen against the medical administration of the Continental Army. After Princeton, Rush was appointed Surgeon General of the Middle Department. What he found in the military hospitals at Bethlehem and Lititz, Pennsylvania, horrified him. These were not places of healing. They were, in his words, sinks of human life. Men wounded in battle were surviving the trauma only to die of putrid fever, typhus, in the crowded, unventilated wards. Rush walked the wards of the Single Brethren's house in Bethlehem, now a makeshift hospital. The air was so foul it was visible, a miasma of excrement, rotting flesh, and unwashed bodies. He saw men sharing blankets with the dead. He saw ambulatory patients, allowed to wander in and out unguarded, trading their rations for rum, which they consumed in stupors while lying in their own filth. Diaries of surgeons like Albigen's Waldo paint a similar picture of the era: smoke and cold, hunger and filthiness, where soldiers cried out, "No meat." Rush, with his obsession for order, blamed one man, Dr. William Shippen, Jr., the Director General of the hospitals. Shippen, a wealthy, polished Philadelphia physician and Rush's former teacher, controlled the supplies. Rush accused Shippen of a deadly corruption, hoarding hospital stores, wine, sugar, and molasses intended for the sick, and selling them for personal profit. While soldiers died for want of nutrition, Rush claimed Shippen was moving large quantities of Madeira wine in hospital wagons, secured as private property. In December 1777, as the army starved at Valley Forge, Rush launched his offensive. He wrote a blistering letter to George Washington on December 26. "I should think myself inexcusable," he wrote, "if I did not inform your Excellency that the distresses and mismanagement of the hospitals arose from the negligence and injustice of the Director General." He detailed the theft and the neglect, pointing out that one half the soldiers who have been thus sacrificed might have proved hereafter the price of a victory. Washington, beleaguered and cautious, referred the matter to Congress. Rush, impatient and self-righteous, escalated. He began a whispering campaign, caught up in the fringes of the Conway Cabal, a loose movement of officers critical of Washington's leadership. In January 1778, Rush wrote an unsigned letter to Patrick Henry, the governor of Virginia. In it, he poured out his frustration, contrasting the discipline of the Northern Army under Gates with the chaos under Washington. "The people of America have been guilty of idolatry in making a man their god," he wrote, a thinly veiled attack on Washington. He urged that the letter be thrown into the fire. Patrick Henry did not burn it. He sent it to Washington. Washington recognized Rush's handwriting immediately. The revelation was devastating. Rush, the man who had treated the wounded at Princeton, was now branded a schemer and a disruption to the war effort. Washington, icy and formidable, allowed Rush to resign rather than face a court-martial for insubordination. Rush left the army in 1778, bitter and defeated. He retreated to his practice in Philadelphia, carrying the weight of his failure to reform the system. He had been right about the filth and the corruption. History would vindicate his complaints about the hospitals, but his lack of political tact had destroyed his military career. Banished from the army, Rush turned his restless energy toward a new frontier, the human mind. In 1783, he joined the staff of Pennsylvania Hospital, where the lunatics were kept in the damp, unheated basement, chained to the walls like animals. Rush was appalled. True to his nature, he did not just want to improve their care, he wanted to cure them. He is often called the father of American psychiatry, a title earned through a mix of compassion and mechanical intervention. He rejected the idea that madness was demonic possession. To Rush, mental illness was, like yellow fever, a disease of the blood vessels, an inflammation of the brain. If the brain was overexcited, it had to be calmed. Rush brought his heroic methods to the asylum. He bled patients to reduce the impetus of blood to the head. He purged them, but he also invented machines. The most infamous was the tranquilizing chair. It was a heavy wooden contraption resembling a high-backed chair with straps for the ankles, wrists, and chest. A wooden box was lowered over the patient's head to block out all light and sound. The patient was strapped in, immobile, often for hours. Rush believed that by completely restricting muscular movement, he could slow the pulse and thus cool the brain. He saw it as humane, a way to restrain the maniac without the brutality of whips or chains. To the patient, however, it was a sensory deprivation chamber of terrifying confinement, complete with a bucket beneath the seat to catch alvean evacuations. Conversely, for patients who were torpid or depressed, hypochondriasis, Rush designed the gyrator. This was a rotating board on which the patient was strapped and spun at high speed, centrifugal force rushing blood to the head to awaken the sluggish brain. Rush's rounds at the hospital were a study in contradictions. He would sit with a patient, taking detailed notes on their delusions with genuine empathy. He recorded the case of a man who believed he was a glass bottle and feared being smashed. He successfully campaigned for a new wing to house the mentally ill in better conditions with heat and ventilation. He urged doctors to treat them with respect and to catch their eye. Yet the next moment, he would order that same patient strapped into the tranquilizer or bled until they fainted. His work laid the foundation for the medicalization of mental illness, moving the insane from the prison to the hospital. But his specific methods, the bleeding, the spinning, the binding, were a harrowing reflection of his worldview, that the chaotic human organism must be forced into order by the sheer will of the physician. By October 1793, Benjamin Rush was a ghost haunting the city he refused to leave. He was gaunt, his skin gray, his hands trembling as he mixed the powders of jalap and calomel. The 10 and 10 purge had become the rhythm of his life. He had treated thousands, seeing over 100 patients a day at the peak. The toll was catastrophic. Rush himself contracted the fever. He lay in his bed, the familiar crushing headache behind his eyes, the heat radiating from his skin. He did not hesitate. He ordered himself bled. He took his own Thunderbolts. He lay shivering, weak from the loss of blood, but he survived, attributing his recovery to his method, reinforcing his fanaticism. But Rush could not be everywhere. As he lay invalid, and later as he staggered back to his rounds, he relied on a group of assistants who history would largely ignore, but whom Rush acknowledged in private letters. Foremost among them was Marcus Marsh, a formerly enslaved man who had grown up in the Rush household. Rush wrote to his wife, "I cannot tell you how much we all owe to Marcus. His integrity, industry, and fidelity deserve great praise. He would exceed many of our bark and wine doctors." Marsh mixed medicines, bled patients, and carried the dying, risking his life daily. Alongside Marsh were the free African Americans of Philadelphia, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. Rush had initially believed black people were immune to the fever, a tragic error, and asked them to serve as nurses. They answered the call, nursing the white population that despised them, only to die in equal numbers. They bled, purged, cleaned the black vomit from the bedsheets, and drove the death carts to the potter's fields. By late October, the air in Philadelphia changed. The oppressive humidity broke. A sharp, cold wind blew in from the north. The frost appeared on the pumpkins in the market and stiffened the mud in the streets. The frost killed the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, though Rush, believing in miasma, simply thanked God for purifying the air. The number of new cases plummeted. The death carts rolled less frequently. At the Bush Hill Hospital, which had been a charnel house before Stephen Girard took it over, a white flag was raised, signaling that no yellow fever patients remained. Rush stood in the doorway of his home, alive but broken. His sister was dead. 3 of his apprentices were dead. His practice was decimated. His reputation under assault by other doctors who called his bleeding murderous. He watched the first refugees return to the city, handkerchiefs still pressed to their faces. He had fought the War of 1793 with the same ferocity he had shown at Princeton, wielding his lancet like a sword. The fever had receded, not because of his bleeding, but because of the ice. He wiped his brow, the cold air stinging his skin, and turned back inside to his books. The city was silent no longer, but the ghosts of the 10% who had died would walk with him, forever.